Welcome to What is Going for new thought from the edge of Each week on Times flagship radio show, veteran broadcaster, author, and media consultant Sandie Sedgbeer conducts thought-provoking interviews with inspirational authors, artists, musicians, scientists, speakers, and filmmakers who are working at the point where spirituality and science meet consciousness at the very edge of Here is your host, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello. If there's one question that's plagued humanity since the beginning of time, it is, what happens after we die? Well, after many decades of research, today's guests are finally going to give us the answer. With me now to discuss their groundbreaking book, Proof of Afterlife, 7 Reasons to Believe in the Afterlife, are longtime collaborators Dr. Raymond Moody, who is the leading authority on the near-death experience and author of the 13 million plus best-selling book, Life After Life, which completely changed the way that we view death and dying, and Paul Perry, who's written dozens of books on NDEs and co-authored 5 New York Times bestsellers, including Saved by the Light with Dannion Brinkley, and directed 2 popular documentary films on the subject. Dr. Raymond Moody, Paul Perry, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Now, I'm sure you guys have been interviewed many times together, so you probably have it all worked out who's going to answer what. But if you'd rather I direct questions to you in turn, we can do that too. What's your preference?
My thought is, I'd like to go with the flow of your, thoughts, because, the folks listening in, and so to whom I want to say hello, by the way, and thanks to those who are viewing us.
So you two have worked together for over 30 years and produced, 6 books together now. How did your collaboration begin?
Well, I knew nothing about near-death experiences, and I didn't know Dr. Raymond Moody. I didn't know who he was. But I was approached by our agent because we shared the same book agent, Nat Sobel. And Nat contacts me, this must have been 34 years ago. And he says, would you like to write a book? I was editing a big health magazine, American Health Magazine. Most successful magazine of the 80s, by the way. I've got to get that in. And Nat says to me, would you like to write a book with Dr. Raymond Moody? And I said, I don't have any idea who Dr. Raymond Moody is. And he says, well, he's the man who named and defined the near-death experience. I said, I don't know what a near-death experience is. And he said, for the editor of a large consumer health magazine, you're lacking some education. So you should go down to Georgia and see Raymond and see if you're interested in getting educated in near-death experiences. So I did. I flew down. We took an immediate liking to one another. And I helped write, along with Raymond, of course, The Light Beyond, which was a book that dealt with research that had been done since Life After Life had been written. I think it was, 10 or so years earlier. And in the course of writing that book, I saw a gap. And the gap was that there was no research in this book, or existing really, on children and near-death experiences. And I thought that children had a large place in this area. So I asked Raymond, is anyone doing research? And he said, yeah, there's a guy named Melvin Morris, a pediatrician in Seattle. Why don't you contact him? Which I did. And Melvin was in the process of starting research on children and near-death experiences. And so I wrote a proposal, and Nat sent it out to 20 publishers, and it was rejected by 19. And one publisher, Diane Reverend, who was at the time with Random House, looked at it and she said, if you handle this right, it's going to be a huge bestseller. And when she told me that, I was sitting there reading these rejection letters. And some of the rejection letters were that people don't care that much about their children. Our children don't have much to say about things like this. Our children make up stories. In one case, my proposal got rejected because it had a typo on page 2, and I was thinking, good luck with this book. We'll write it, but I don't think it's going to do anything. And it turned out to be enormous, and it launched the field of children and near-death studies, and it kept Raymond and I together, and it kept Melvin and I together, and then that just grew. From that point on, every book I helped write, I was looking for the vacuum. I was looking for the blank spot. And in that regard, I've written 15 books now on near-death experiences, maybe more. And Raymond and I have written 6 of those. So,
And there's thousands on Amazon. I recently actually, did a search on that phrase. Thousands of them.
yeah.
So yes, the whole world is, and why wouldn't we be fascinated? I mean, come on, it's something all of us want to know. All of us.
Sure.
Yeah. So, Dr. Moody, you Life After Life was published in 1975, and for 4 decades, you refused to declare NDEs as proof of consciousness after death.
Yeah.
Now, you're taking your research public. What has happened to make you say, okay, we're going to look at this again. We're going to talk about it now?
Okay, what this is all, I was a professor of logic, and, concept of proof is basic to logic. And so for decades now, people have come up to me, and the question they ask over and over is, Raymond or Dr. Moody, do you think there's any kind of proof? Well, as a logician, it brings to my mind things so I don't know what they're talking about. So over the years, I've had to ask, what is it that people are looking for when they ask that? Quite apart from all the many technicalities of this concept. But, we don't want to be dwelling down at the level of the tabloids with the word proof. But this is what I think. And that is that I think what people are asking me, or have been asking me for decades, not technically oriented people, but just folks who haven't going through a grief or afraid of death or whatever, is it a rational thing to anticipate that there is an afterlife? I think that's all they want to know. And I say resoundingly, yeah. Although that is still very counterintuitive to me, not having a template from this from childhood. But I can explain where I got there. And I also want to explain that I'm not trying to persuade anybody else, okay? But my process is I never took seriously this idea is that these near-death experiences are oxygen deprivation to the brain. That is a debate that actually goes back to Plato and Democritus, who came along a little bit before Plato. Plato looked at these near-death experiences and said they indicate an afterlife. Democritus, who had figured out that things are made of atoms, said, no, this is just the invisible biological activity of the body that's going on the atomic level. And he said, there's no such thing as a moment of death. Well, see, that was 2,300 years ago. Isn't it interesting that we're still stuck in this same framework of debate, right? And today we call it, thanks to Lavoisier, today it's oxygen deprivation to the brain. Okay, well, and people are going to hold on to that framework of thinking about this no matter what, because it makes them feel safe in the reality of a very complex subject. Well, the reason I have never held on to that is that one of my own professors in medical school told me my first year of medical school that because by the time I went to medical school, I was already known for investigating this. I'd been for 10 years. So this professor approached me and said, Dr. Moody, I've been wanting to talk to you about, it's funny, she said, some mentation I had when I was resuscitating my mother. And she talked about how she had unsuccessfully tried to resuscitate her mother, but that as it was going on, she herself, lifted up and saw the scene from above and saw her mother there in spirit form, she said, and this tunnel or with the light and the apparitions of the deceased loving company. Then this all went away, and then her mother receded, and then she went back to her body. And subsequently, I've heard hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of those. And so what I'm getting at is that this experience people call the near-death experience occurs, all the common elements of it occur also to people nearby, standing at the bedside, for example, who are not themselves ill and injured. So something else is going on than oxygen deprivation to the brain if the bystanders who are not ill or injured have the same experience. Okay, now that was where I was in medical school. Where I have been subsequently is that it's just because it is not oxygen deprivation to the brain does not mean that it is life after death. You see, there's a big gap there. And I've been trying, what could this be? What you try to do to have most fun in the intellectual process is to try to knock down everything. That's the fun, because what you're left with is, is more likely to be true. And so, I just never knew what to think, to tell you the truth. I understood that these people were sincere. Where I finally came around was, some years back. I began to reflect on near-death experiences that my medical colleagues have had. For example, Dr. Anthony Cicoria, who is a professor of orthopedic surgery and MD and a PhD in physiology at NYU, who in 1994 was struck in the head by a bolt of lightning and had a cardiac arrest, was resuscitated, went out of his body through this resort center where his family was gathered for a family reunion, was able to tell everybody what they were doing. Saw everything, and Anthony says this was not just real, it's more real than real. Came back, unaccountably had never had any interest in music, but then developed an interest in the piano, and saw himself dreamed that he was playing a certain piece of music on a concert stage on a piano. Learned how to transcribe music to transcribe the piece. And now, in addition to being a professor of orthopedic surgery, is a concert pianist. Or let's one other kind of account. A dear friend, Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll, who is an emergency room doctor, who some years ago, when Jeff Olson, an advertising agency director and owner, graphic artist, was in a horrible car crash, has had his leg smashed off, had a near-death experience on the table. His wife was killed instantly in the crash, as was one of his children. But as Jeff was in the hospital having his near-death experience, Jeff O'Driscoll, the ER doctor, walked in and saw and had a conversation with Jeff Olson's dead wife in the ER. Now, and I could go on giving you like a dozen or so accounts of this, of medical doctors I know, and I would put my life in their hands if, heaven forbid, I had a medical problem. And so, it's just gradually dawned on me, well, I don't have any other way of dealing with this. If all of these people I know and respect, and completely respect their medical judgment, are unanimous in saying that their experience was more real than real, and that they agree on the nature of it. I literally give up. And that's one aspect of it.
Yeah. I would say that, the evidence that you and others have delivered about shared death experiences is the clincher. when more than one person is involved. There's that wonderful story about the hot shots, I'm sure you've heard that one, the fire crew, who all of them left their bodies and were able to communicate with one another and then came back. And they all shared that experience. And you share others in the book. In fact, I think you've had some yourselves, haven't you?
Well, we have. I mean, that in a way, that's what kicked this whole book off. Over the years, as we know now, we've written 6 books together. In every one of the books, actually, we've had a shared death experience that we've quoted as a case study, and we kind of never really thought about it as proof. Funny that we really didn't, but then both of us had shared death experiences of our own. I mean, I had one when my mother died, but a very different one. I'd worked on a book on deja vu with the head of neuropharmacology, at University of Washington, Vernon Neppy. And we worked on this book for several years, and then we just lost touch. I hadn't contacted him for about 5 years. So the morning that my mother was dying, I got a call from Vernon. I hadn't spoken to him, like I say, in 5 years. I got a call from Vernon, and he said, I was sitting here, it was on a Sunday. I was sitting here reading the newspaper, and a female voice said, "Call Paul Perry." And I ignored it. And I kept reading the paper, and about an hour later, he said, this female voice said, "Call Paul Perry." So I'm calling you, and I don't know why. And I told him, well, maybe it's because of your specialty, which his specialty was really Alzheimer's. And my mother was dying of Alzheimer's. And he told me a number of things they had done in desperation to try to improve people's Alzheimer's situation, including electroshock therapy and some other kind of drugs. And he said, talk to her doctor about doing these things, and maybe it'll improve her, at least calm her down a little bit. Well, in the meantime, I got a phone call. A phone call came in, and I said, Vern, I'll talk to you later. I have to answer this call. And my mother had just died. The care facility called to tell me she had passed away. That, of course, classifies as a shared death experience in a very odd way, because my mother ends up, I'm thinking, talking to Vernon, who then comes back and, tells me what he's heard. Raymond had an experience as well, but let me deal with the rest of this. We were working on a different book, and we're sitting on Raymond's porch. Raymond rocks, so you can hear in the audio tapes I take whenever I interview Raymond, the sound of him rocking and the sound of the creek in the back. And we started talking about all these shared death experiences we had collected over the years. And then we started to analyze them and realize that these are in many ways, in every way, really, proof of an afterlife. And that's what kicked off this whole book, that and then Raymond's experience as well.
Yeah.
One of the things that a lot of people say to me when I talk about this is, well, if it happens to so many people, why doesn't it happen to me? Do we know whether they're, what makes some people more susceptible, more open to this? Is it a belief? Is it religion? Is it, do you have any evidence there?
Let me throw in, and then Raymond will take over, I'm sure, but I don't think it's belief. I mean, I can point to certain other things happening. Sometimes people who are at the bedside will experience a shared death experience, and they're atheists. And other people at the same bedside are very religious, and they don't experience that shared death experience. In a kind of a different realm, I was in Egypt a few years ago doing a documentary film about visions in Egypt. And what I found was that there have been some really very famous visions in Egypt involving lights flashing, involving direct appearances of what is defined as the Virgin Mary. And these visions will last for long periods of time. So it's not like they happen once and they happen for 5 minutes and that's it. They'll go on for weeks, sometimes months at a time. And the people who show up, some are very devout and they can't see the vision. Whereas other people who are not very devout at all, or downright atheists and even upset about seeing the vision, will see the vision. And the same is true in near-death experiences. Some people encounter it, some people don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's been my experience from when I started out researching this in the 60s, was that religion didn't seem to have anything to do really with whether people had these experiences or not. Because I had plenty of people who, according to their account, had no religious background to speak of, who had these experiences, and other people who were quite devout who had nothing. So, it's some other factor or factors. And what it is, I don't know. I've never known exactly why some do and some don't.
I was
But
There is
looking at some research recently, and I read that some studies show that women have more after-death communication experiences than men, out of the ones that were studied in this particular piece of research.
I made that observation in Life After Life. Even then, I said, that I had noticed at that time that more women told me about these experiences than men. And I speculated, I didn't know why, or maybe, men are just more reluctant to talk. But in the case of near-death experiences, that's turned around now that it's kind of known. Men are less timid to talk about them than they were.
Yeah.
There are some great studies. I mean, William Roll did the study on, Erlander Haraldsson in Iceland did a study on apparitions of the dead experienced by widows. And he found that about 60% of widows have communication with their spouse, even to the point of being able to feel them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know people who've told me that.
Yeah, I think it's very common. I do know, as Raymond says, men are more less reluctant to speak about these. But I have spoken to a lot of men, particularly lately, because I've been asking this question, and they say they have communication with their late wives.
Yeah. So the book, I mean, what is the subtitle? It's 7 Reasons to Believe. What are those 7 reasons? I know that shared death experiences is one, and it is a very, very compelling, strong reason as well. What are the others?
Well, one that comes to my mind, because I'm not very musical. After Elvis stopped recording, I kind of gave it up. And I'm really not musical, but nonetheless, I have been fascinated over the years how many times music and poetry are involved in the death process. And a big awakening point in my life was at age 18, reading Plato's dialogue, The Phaedo, which is still my favorite book. And the startling scene at the very beginning, it's the day that Socrates dies, is executed. And in the very morning, his friends come into the prison. What's this we hear about? You've been writing songs in prison, implying he's kind of slipping because he never took music seriously. Oh no, he said, I've been having dreams and visions that tell me to write songs. And so he's been doing it. And then he goes on about this, comparing it to the swan song. The Greeks had a folk belief that just before swans die, they sing the most beautiful songs because, Socrates says, they're anticipating being with the gods. And this was striking. Anybody who's ever read that dialogue will remember that fantastic scene in the beginning. Well, flash forward to 12 years. I was a second-year medical student in 1974 in my surgery rotation. And one day I just walked in and my 2 attendings were behind me. And I would just because and I walked in and I happened to see this woman in her 70s having a cardiac arrest. So, we all started doing the resuscitation thing. But as she was dying, she was reciting poetry. I mean, I didn't have the presence of mind to say, what's that again? I mean, but I could, the meter and the rhythm and, the rhyme. And, but then subsequently to that, I mean, I've heard literally hundreds of cases of this. That people say that although whoever and the relative never had any interest whatsoever in music or poetry, that just in those days and hours before they die, they sing or they recite poetry, sometimes make up poetry. And I have two people in my own association network who sang as they were dying. Right. And I didn't learn about this through probing about that, just heard about this. So what that means is that this is something that's common enough to bear investigation.
Light is one of them too. And I remember watching Martin Scorsese's documentary on George Harrison, Living in a Material World. And at the end, George's wife talks about the incredible light that filled the room when George died.
Yes. And people say the light fills the room. People say that apparitions of the dying person's deceased relatives come into the room. People say the room, it is no longer three-dimensional. They say you can't describe it, but you feel like you're looking at it, things from an impossible angle. And the person who's dying may light up. I know that sounds so crazy, but I've seen it, and people in hospice, about this, and it can't be, but it is, and they become very lucid. And now here's the most startling and uncomfortable thing I know about Sandie, in connection with these near-death experiences, is that I have quite a number of cases who were people who were at the bedside of someone else who died, and that as the person was dying, the bystander empathically co-lived the dying life review of the person.
Wow.
And that is just so startling. And for years, I thought this has to be somebody very intimate with the dying person, right? First two cases I heard of it were women who were both had lost their adolescent sons. They were both in their 40s. Both had lost their adolescent sons. But then, I hear more and more. I heard from an elderly woman in Carrollton, Georgia, that her lifelong partner, her husband, they had grown up since kids and married, but as he was dying in the hospital, she said she was just right there with him in his life review. And then my wife and I got a communication some years back from a ER doctor who was called to the ER to resuscitate a patient he had never laid eyes on. And as this man was dying, he said that life review of the guy was right around me. I mean, I give up. See, it's just, this is past the place where this can be discounted, I think, by the standard ways of discounting it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, let's face it, since the beginning of time, Indigenous peoples have been talking about talking to the ancestors, etc. Why do we insist on having, some definitive piece of science that tells us this is real?
Right. And there's actually a recent documentary about some cave spelunkers, I guess you call it. Yes. I've never seen that in South Africa, where they go very deep into a very difficult cave, and they find at the bottom a number of pre-Homo sapien people buried ritualistically. They're all buried in the same form. I think they're kind of curled up, and they all have tools with them.
Yeah.
And the implication there is that even before Homo sapiens, they were believing in an afterlife.
They were trying to dig a hole to China.
Oh, this was there already, Raymond. So it was extremely difficult cave, even with lights, ropes.
Yeah, I watched the documentary on TV about that. Amazing.
It
We
was
have to take a short break now. You're listening to What Is Going On. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and my guests today are psychiatrist, philosopher, best-selling author, and the leading authority on the near-death experience, Dr. Raymond Moody, and documentary filmmaker and New York Times best-selling author Paul Perry. And we're talking about their latest groundbreaking book, Proof of Life After Life: 7 Reasons to Believe There Is an Afterlife. We'll be back with more in a few moments, so stay tuned.
Om Times TV. Imagine becoming a super influencer. Reinvent yourself, invest in your brand, and then manifest your success with a robust spheric approach. Om Times Media and Broadcasting offers a unique and multifaceted way to become the spiritual and conscious influencer you deserve to be by putting your message across our powerful platform with its proven record of integrity and excellence. Through our produced shows, Om Times offers the opportunity to become a social media TV personality, a radio show host, an Om Times magazine columnist, and a syndicated podcaster, all in one shot. By live streaming your show on Om Times TV and broadcasting it across the extensive Om Times radio and TV networks, you become more than a host. You become an ambassador and a force for positive change. Om Times. Open yourself to the possibilities.
Hello, I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, host of Om Times flagship radio show, What Is Going On? And as an author, editor, and 13 times book judge who's read thousands of books and interviewed hundreds of authors, I'm constantly asked what's really worth reading and what's not. So I created the No BS Spiritual Book Club to help you save time and money by picking the brains of discerning names who've walked this path before you. There's no catch, no fees, and no BS. Just an ever-growing library of 10 best spiritual book lists from some of your favourite authors and teachers, plus free book excerpts, audios and video interviews with people like Don Miguel Ruiz Jr., David G., Lee Harris, Mark Nepo and more. From well-known classics to hidden gems you've never heard of, it's the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to enlighten your journey of self-discovery. So why not join the club? Get inspired and save money at the nobsspiritualbookclub.com.
I wanted to talk to you about a program called the Dream Arc and a retreat that we're doing, and I want to invite you along. And the Dream Arc is a dream technology. And even the latest physics is suggesting now that reality is not what we think it is, that it's kind of a construct. And that the Dream Arc teaches us how to use the full operating system to navigate our brain frequencies between waking and sleeping and dreaming, and to move through the inner realms and the outer realms seamlessly. And you will work in the Dream Arc with certain animals that will come to you, maybe in real life, maybe through your intuition, in magical ways, or perhaps through, just dreams that come to you. It's filled, the Dream Arc, with invitations and suggestions and tasks that you choose intuitively. You choose the ones for you. You don't know what you're choosing, but they come to you. So please join us as we dive down the wormhole into the Dream Arc, and let's see what happens.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Welcome back. Dr. Raymond Moody, Paul Perry. There are so many things in this book that I want to discuss. I think we could do a whole series of interviews. I think it's a really really important book. And I know it's not officially published yet, but looking on Amazon, I've seen all kinds of plaudits, people saying this is the definitive book on NDEs and life after death. I want to talk to you about the seventh reason that you list, which is your psychomantium and the reunions experiment. Tell me a little bit about that and what the results were.
Sandie, I thank you for saying that, because I've been fascinated by the fact that this hasn't gathered attention more than anything else in the past few years. And thank you for acknowledging it. This goes back to the ancient Greeks. This is how I found out about it. They had these places called oracles of the dead, and they had various techniques for evoking the spirits of the dead. And so, to make a long story short, in reading the archaeological account of one of these places and seeing what they found there, I was able to put together that with my knowledge of altered states of consciousness as a psychiatrist to figure out what they were doing, and I set it up, and it works. Basically, and this has been known not just among the Greeks, but from antiquity, from prehistoric times, that many people, when they gaze into what's called an optical clear depth, it can be the clear surface of a pond with a smooth bottom. It can be, as in the Middle East today, a silver bowl polished highly on the inside, filled with olive oil by candlelight. It can be a mirror in a dark room, and that's what I did. I set up a room about the size of a closet, and put a mirror on the wall above the line of sight of a person who was sitting comfortably in a easy chair about 3 feet in front of the wall, and leaning slightly back so that they can get comfortable. And the mirror is up above. When they look in the mirror, they don't see their own reflection. The room is darkened, and the one I did, all the surroundings were painted flat black, so that excludes reflections.
Mm-hmm.
And behind the comfortable easy chair, a little light with a rheostat attached to it, or dimmer switch, so that the person could adjust the level of light in the room to their own liking. And so that's all the apparatus you need. The operative part is the preparation. Is basically what I would ask the people to do is choose one deceased person who's died that you want to see again, a deceased person known to you. And incidentally, my subjects were initially my graduate students of psychology. A number of them had been out already in practice and counseling, but were back for further education. So these were mature people. And as word about my study spread, a psychologist friend of mine, a sociology professor, an anesthesiologist, a medical, just out of curiosity was what we were doing. And so I would ask the people, as I said, to choose one person. They would come to my place one at a time. This takes a while. It's not an instant gratification thing by any means. And basically, I would just ask them, tell me about this person who died, and what are your good memories? What were they like? Then what were some of the sticking points, the unfinished business in the relationship? This takes what, an hour or two? You can't time it by the clock. It's a process. You get the person talking and remembering about the person they want to see. Then you would put them into this chamber, and so that the door closed, so it completely dark in there, except for the light behind. I would just ask them to sit comfortably in the chair and gaze into the mirror, let your mind go blank, and all these things come around. And then I said, I'll be back in about an hour and 30 minutes, left it vague, and if anything's going on, shush me away, but otherwise come on out when you already, but under those circumstances, Sandie, I honestly thought that if I did 50 of these, I would finally get about 5 people who had a vision. And if they saw it, they'd say, yeah, I saw an image and it looked like my grandma, but was it real or figment? That's what I was expecting, because these were people who were educated in the mind. What I found is just utterly startling to me, and it's been replicated numerous times by other people. And anybody listening to this can replicate it for themselves if they want to put the work into it. And what you find is that the people, as anticipated, many of them do say that they see the image of the deceased person in the mirror. But other people say that the deceased person in the mirror then steps out of the mirror and comes fully three-dimensional into the room with them. Other people say that they feel that they go through the mirror, their consciousness, and they come out into some other environment where that's where they meet their deceased loved ones. All kinds of surprises about this. Number one, about a quarter of the people see some other deceased person known to them rather than or in addition to the person they set out to see. So it doesn't seem to operate on what you wish. And a number of people have reflected afterward that, as one woman said, I wanted to see my husband, but as I got to reflecting on it afterward, the person I needed to see was my father, who was the one who showed up. See, so about 30% of the people say they hear the audible voice of the deceased, not as an inward experience. Almost all the rest of them, the 70%, say that it's a heart-to-heart or a mind-to-mind communion. And to my utter surprise, people interpret this to be a real event. And that is the most startling aspect of it to me. I'm speechless still. And in my study, it was about 50% of the people who had the experience on the first attempt. But others have got it better. The study of this has been done at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology by Arthur Hastings, who reproduced my study, and who did in his study, it was 63% of the people who had, and others have replicated it well. And what we found, and here's the best news, it does seem to help in the grieving process.
Yeah. That's actually beginning to appear in the news now. Just 2 weeks ago, I was sending my friends, something that I'd seen on my news feed about a study that was done with people who had died, so to speak, and they, were having CPR, etc. When they came back, and some of them, it was an hour later, they were talking about having accessed alternate realities, and I think they were also showing that the brain, things were still happening, that the consciousness was still there. And if that's in mainstream news, we must be getting closer now.
Well, it's just a thing of the accumulation of people who have had some sort of life experience of stepping over to another world. And since people in this era that we're in tend to live longer than in the past, and then as the older you get, the more the likelihood is that you've had such an experience. The development of CPR that's bringing people back from a state that, 100 years ago would have just been called death. So all of this has brought together something that society needs to process this.
Yeah. Paul, do you feel that after 30 years of collaboration that you've got all the answers, or are there questions that are still unanswered?
There's always more questions that have to be answered, but we're answering them very quickly. And one of the things I wanted to bring up in relation to the psychomantium is that we have a really tremendous case that's highly visual. and that is that a woman came from Argentina with her sister. This woman wanted to see her late daughter, who had died, I think, roughly 90 days earlier. And she came to see Raymond at his psychomantium in Alabama. And she went through the induction process as he described it, but it didn't work. I mean, she insisted that it be done as soon as she got off the plane, and she wasn't really primable, if you will. And so this was at about 3:30 in the afternoon. It didn't work, and her sister went back to the hotel. And while they were sitting in the hotel talking about what had taken place, like once again, it's 3:30 in the afternoon. The room is bright, and all of a sudden, these orbs appear in the room. 3 orbs. They start moving around, and luckily, the sister took 3 photographs of them. And one of the orbs moves close to the woman who wanted to see her daughter, and she said that she immediately went into kind of a trance situation where she started speaking to the orb, and her daughter was inside the orb. And the beauty of this is that we have photographs of the orbs and her testimony about what she heard, which I'll be glad to send you the photos so you can put them into this report.
Well, I have to tell you that a former client of mine, I worked on her first 2 books with her. She now has a show on this network too. She lost a son just before his 28th birthday. Mediums told her that he was going to be talking to her and working with her. And indeed that has happened. And he told her to start using her camera. She now has a collection of orbs that she photographs around people, and she can see their loved ones in those orbs, and she describes them. Yeah.
Well, a lot of what is researched here is the kind of thing that people don't believe until it happens to them.
Yeah.
And then they can't stop looking for the answers. Another thing that I think is amazing about the work we've been doing is the number of doctors who've loosened up about this, and they've started talking about their own cases that they've experienced or that they've seen their patients experience. And that's way different from the way it used to be. When I was working on The Light Beyond, I was also working with a cardiologist in Cleveland, doing a book on reversing heart disease. And one day we were standing at a nurse's station in the hospital, and the doctor said to me, "What are you working on besides this book?" And I told him about near-death experiences and about Raymond. And he said, "I have resuscitated hundreds of people, and no one's ever told me anything about a near-death experience. I don't believe that they even exist." And then he was called away from the station. So he went to another part of the hospital, and all the nurses came up to the counter, and they said, "Well, we've heard near-death experiences a lot. And the difference between us and the doctors is they don't talk to their patients. They don't ask their patients, questions about what happened when you died." And that's changed now. And many doctors as well are having their own experiences, and they're willing to speak about them. And so that is going to help society in general start to examine these themselves. And instead of approaching them from a point of disbelief, which many people who call themselves skeptics do, they're now approaching these questions about these paranormal experiences from the area of belief. And I guarantee you, if you start to look at it and say, "Well, this might be happening," as opposed to saying it doesn't happen, it's BS, you're going to get different answers.
Yeah. Gary Schwartz, you obviously know he's at Arizona University. I understood a couple of years ago that he was working on creating a device, almost like a spirit telephone, where people could speak to their departed loved ones. Do you know anything about that and what's happening with that piece of work?
I do, and I think Raymond probably knows more than I do. I
have no idea
you
about it.
heard anything about it.
My wife moved in. We married 30-something years ago, and when she moved into my house, my only apparatus for communication was my hand cranked Edison phonograph, which Paul will remember too. So I'm not don't have the kind of competence that would be required to evaluate a spirit phone.
Yeah, Raymond is a primitive in some way, but Gary hasn't made much progress on that, really. I heard him speak about it, and it was, I hate to say, an unconvincing talk, but he admits that he hasn't made much progress at all on it. So that's about all.
Just one thing I can tell you from common sense: don't ever except to collect call from the beyond.
Yeah, I wonder what the payment would be.
That's right.
So, this really does have to be, and I don't know why others don't think so, the most important thing ever. Because if we can get people to accept and understand this, believe it, then everything has to change. Everything has to change. We cannot continue to war with one another. We cannot, continue to do the things that we've been doing. Do you feel that we are anywhere near that point where people will take this as a consensus?
Sandie, what I think is that we are in a situation where now we can satisfy the real difficulties of rational investigation of the afterlife. A lot of them people put up are not real, but the real ones were stated by David Hume, for example, the great skeptic who influenced Einstein, among others, and people like A.J. Ayer, the great analytic philosopher, and his crew, and that kind of, as the analytical philosophers pointed out, the conceptual difficulties in thinking about the afterlife. And David Hume said, by the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. Some new species of logic is required for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind that they may enable us to comprehend that logic. And he was saying that to mean that it's impossible. But I say, number one, he's right in the criterion, but number two, he's wrong by saying it's impossible. I say that the philosophical difficulties that have held rational investigation back are solved. That is, to me, a given, that we do have a logic that fits Hume's requirement. But that is not what most people who are interested in the afterlife are going to be interested in. That's the difficulty. It's because it's not a narrative thing, right? It's not stories. It requires your conceptual thinking. But the reason I can say comfortably to people who are not interested in the abstractions, the reason that I can say comfortable with people, it's real. I mean, I gather there is an afterlife, is that in the back of my mind is this fact that the philosophical problems that most people are not interested in, in my mind, are satisfactorily solved, and also that the best minds that I put this to find holes in it were unable to. So, that's my confidence, not just on the experiential level, but on the conceptual level.
Well, I'm afraid we're almost out of time. Is there one thing that you would like to share very briefly with our listeners, our viewers, before you go? Paul?
I'll do it, sure. I went to Egypt several years ago, and I made a film about the trail of Jesus through Egypt. It's apocryphal, or perhaps not. But I was talking to the Pope, the Coptic Pope, and the Pope said, on this journey, keep in mind that grace is all around you. And all you have to do is think about it, reach out to it, and it's there. And I think that journey applies to the journey of life as well as just a journey through Egypt. So that's how I feel about this material.
Yeah.
Is people need to look at it in an open-minded fashion.
Yeah.
And see where that leads them.
Yeah. And feel it.
Yeah.
You know, if
Sure.
they feel it, I'm certain that will override a lot of the doubts in people's minds. Dr. Raymond Moody, Paul Perry, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. And thanks to the folks listening in too. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandie.
Proof of Life After Life, 7 Reasons to Believe in the Afterlife is published by Beyond Words. For more information about Dr. Raymond Moody's work, visit lifeafterlife.com, and you can learn more about Paul Perry's books, videos and events at paulperryproductions.com. That brings us to the end of this week's show. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer. I'll be back at the same time next week with another edition of What Is Going On. Till then, it's goodbye from me, and thank you again to Raymond Moody and Paul Perry.